Hi, everyone. Welcome to In Limbo Conversations. Today we have with us Ian Olasov. He teaches philosophy at Brooklyn College and studies philosophy at CUNY Graduate Center. His work is primarily on applied philosophy of language, social epistemology, and public philosophy. He's also the founder and organizer of Brooklyn Public Philosophers, which is a public philosophy event series for a general audience. One of the interesting events they have been organizing for quite a few years now is Ask a Philosopher. And Ian recently published his experiences at Ask a Philosopher booths in form of a book, which came out in mid-September. And for more information about his research and his public philosophy work, please check the links in the video description below. Thank you so much for joining me, Ian.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
So Ian's doctoral research, so I'm just going to give a short background. So Ian's doctoral research is on speech in the public interest, and I thought we could focus on the second essay, which has sort of come alive and has become very relevant during this pandemic time, the Movement for Black Lives, which is MBL. And in this essay, you present four newly characteristic forms of speech associated with MBL and how they address the challenges that the movement faces. So these four new forms were hashtag and slogan, Black Lives Matter, videos of police violence, naming the dead, and what you have called stereotype engineering. So could you tell us about a few concrete pandemic-related instances where you have come across these forms and also how this sort of fits into your overall research? And if you want to focus on any one of the forms, that would be cool too.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. We can sort of go through them one by one. So obviously the sort of form of speech or the string of words which is most closely associated with the movement for Black Lives is just the phrase Black Lives Matter, which originated as a hashtag and became a kind of slogan for the movement. And hashtags and slogans are two different sorts of things. And so to combine them into one string of words has some interesting consequences. So hashtags can be used in any number of ways, but the sort of central use, the use for which they were designed, is to categorize social media posts in a way that makes them searchable and in that way discoverable or visible to people outside of the poster's own social network, right? So you click on the hashtag Black Lives Matter and you don't just see your friends' BLM posts, you see everybody else's. And by doing that, you can do any number of things. In the case of Black Lives Matter, one thing that makes it a little bit sort of unique or distinct from other sorts of hashtags is that while other hashtags, say the hashtag dogs or dogs of Instagram or something like that, people before they saw the hashtag dogs knew what dogs were. They could recognize dogs. Before people saw the hashtag Black Lives Matter, they might not have realized that the instances of police and vigilante violence which are aggregated under the hashtag are, instances of people not caring about Black lives, people feeling as if Black lives don't matter. Unlike the hashtag dogs of Instagram, the hashtag Black Lives Matter kind of gives people sort of awareness of a new phenomenon or a new way of thinking about or explaining a phenomenon of which they might have previously been aware. Slogans, on the other hand, are things which when you compare slogans with sort of their nearby non-slogan counterparts, I think the ways in which they differ sort of most obviously or in the most salient ways are that slogans have to do with group solidarity and sort of appealing to the sort of moral authority or credibility that comes with a group. So I think one really interesting example for me is the slogan "Stop the Violence," which was from a short-lived movement or campaign from the late 80s and early 90s, mostly associated with the rapper KRS-One. And it was a sort of movement or campaign revolving around violence within the Black community and within hip hop fans in particular. And I think so there's something really interesting. If you compare the slogan "Stop the Violence" with a nearby non-slogan counterpart, well, what might that counterpart be? I mean, something like Black people and hip hop fans in particular should stop hurting each other. But notice when I say that, as frankly, especially as a white guy, that sounds kind of racist. Like, it's not something I frankly I feel uncomfortable saying it out loud, just even as using it as an example. But of course, when KRS-One says "stop the violence," it doesn't come off as racist because he's appealing to sort of solidarity with this group, which people would not have mistaken for racist, because it was a group that was led by this sort of rapper who's known for being socially conscious, and it's a group which was led by Black people. So the charge of anti-Black racism isn't going to stick in the same way that it would for a non-slogan counterpart. Anyway, I think something similar is going on with Black Lives Matter, that people, when they use the slogan, they appeal to the moral authority of the movement and they express solidarity with the movement. There are all sorts of things which are sort of interesting and important here strategically. One thing that I've pointed out in the past is that the fact that Black Lives Matter is a slogan helps explain this otherwise sort of bizarre circular disagreement between people who say Black Lives Matter and people who say all lives matter. Black Lives Matter is a logical consequence of the phrase all lives matter. So it's hard to see how, without noticing that they're slogans that are attached to different groups, it's hard to see how or why people who adopt the one phrase would disagree with people who adopt the other. And then you realize, oh, it has to do with sort of richer set of, affiliations and political identities that, attach to those two groups. So in any case, I think that's one example. I'll say something, instead of going through all four of these characteristic types of speech associated with MBL, I'll just say something about stereotype engineering, because I think it's interesting. So philosophers in recent years have been really interested sort of explicitly with the project of conceptual engineering. And I think philosophers have done this for as long as people have been doing philosophy, but we're doing it sort of self-consciously in a way that we haven't done it in the past, or sort of reflecting in a meta way about it in a way that we haven't in the past. But typically, I think when people focus on conceptual engineering, they think about, on the one hand, either creating new concepts for, where there's some sort of conceptual lacuna, some conceptual job for which there is no, actually concept, or they think of fixing a concept by sort of massaging its meaning or its extension. So massaging or changing the things that it applies to, or say the mode of presentation under which it presents the things it applies to. And there's, of course, nothing wrong with those types of conceptual engineering, but if we're thinking about what it would mean to fix a concept in order for it to do its job better, well, you could fix its meaning or fix its extension. But of course, concepts have other properties besides meanings and extensions. In particular, they have associated stereotypes. So to get down to brass tacks, to get down to concrete examples, I think stereotype engineering is something that you can see at work in recent uses of the phrase white supremacy, in recent uses of the phrase ethnic cleansing. So the stereotype of a white supremacist for many people in the United States is like a member of the Ku Klux Klan. It rolls off the tongue. A stereotype of ethnic cleansing might be something like the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. But if you understand these phrases in their sort of literal compositional senses, well, they apply to many things that are pretty distant from that stereotype. A white supremacist is anyone who thinks that white people are, in some respect, supreme or superior to other racial groups. And of course, it's not just Klan members who think that. It's perhaps the vast majority of white people in the United States believe in white supremacy in that sense. They might think that, a well-meaning liberal white person might think that, Daniel Patrick Moynihan's a historical example, might think that there's something wrong with Black families, that there's something sort of culturally or morally defective about how Black families are organized. And you think, yeah, well, I guess you're not a Klan member. You're not violently racist, but you sure are a white supremacist if you believe that. And so the more we use these phrases like white supremacist to apply to things that the phrase already literally applies to, but which don't fit the stereotype associated with the phrase, well, you massage the stereotype. You do something to shift the stereotype. The more we use the phrase white supremacist to apply to liberal Democrats, for example, in the United States, the more liberal Democrats are going to become stereotypical for the concept of a white supremacist, the sort of more typical of a white supremacist. Sort of when we think of the kind, those types of people will be, and so. This is, I think, an important thing to do, because while there are, of course, Klan members and violently racist white supremacists in the United States today, cross-burning psychopaths and all that, there are the most insidious and the most powerful forms of white supremacy often don't fit the existing stereotypes, right? The Klan isn't the social force that it was 100 years ago. It just doesn't matter that much as it used to. And so the forms of white supremacy that we need to target, the ones that we really have to deal with in an everyday way, are distant from the sort of actually existing or previously existing stereotypes. So stereotype engineering can help us recognize accurately and quickly forms of white supremacy which otherwise would have been invisible to us in other ways. So that's a very long answer to a short question, but there you go.
So in some sense, it sort of traces the development of certain stereotypes through sort of time, right? So it would sort of frame that. Okay, so you did bring up the point about, this was in the article that you had written for Slate, right? It was about how did All Lives Matter come to oppose Black Lives Matter? You just brought that up. And so you had mentioned two insights from philosophy of long language, which could sort of apply to that case. And, you had talked about, amongst other points, you had talked about the difference between how the term matter in these slogans can play out in the normative or descriptive sense. And also you had talked about quantity implicature. So the Greifian idea that generally in cooperative conversations, we give as much information as is required by the goals of the conversation. So if you feel up to it, could you tell us a bit more about the points that you found interesting in this opposition between them and, how you have sort of come to see them?
Sure. I think there's a kind of to the point about quantity implicature first, there's a kind of, frankly, I think disingenuous, but maybe some people actually believe it, criticism of the phrase Black Lives Matter, according to which people who use the phrase think that only Black Lives Matter. They think because if you say Black Lives Matter with you must be making a quantity implicature. You must be saying in the same way that, for example, if I have $20 in my pocket and I say that I have $10 in my pocket, well, of course, it's literally true that I have $10 in my pocket because I might have a $10 bill there. But the quantity implicature is that I have no more than $10 in my pocket. You might think that, or people sometimes accuse the BLM supporters of thinking that only Black Lives Matter, because if you say that Black Lives Matter, it's like saying you have $10 in your pocket. Yeah. If you thought that all lives mattered, you would say that all lives matter. But I think this doesn't hold up to scrutiny. On the one hand, there is, I mean, I suppose for the main reason it doesn't hold up to scrutiny is that the reason why people say that Black Lives Matter is because it's particularly relevant. There are social problems in the United States which can be explained in terms of people not realizing that Black Lives Matter. It's not a social problem in general that people in the United States fail to recognize that white lives matter, or that rich people's lives matter, or that college professors' lives matter. I don't know. So, you know, while all of those lives matter, it's not especially relevant to point that out, both because people already believe it. It's not an informative thing to tell people, and because there's no practically urgent social problem that we have to deal with on that front. So, you know, that's a very brief explanation of why I think how I think the idea of a quantity implicature and sort of, you know, using a little bit of Gricean philosophy of language can sort of help us sort out this perhaps disingenuous sort of debate that takes place in public. As for the claim that, you know, mattering is either ambiguous or at least people use it in two very different ways, I think that's just sort of interesting, and it's just sort of worth making explicit if we're going to talk about the slogan. To say that something matters, you might think that you might mean that people actually care about it, or that you actually care about it, or roughly that people should care about it. There's this sort of odd tension in the use of which is not necessarily a problem, but it is a tension in the use of the Black Lives Matter slogan, which is that Black lives matter in that sort of normative sense, that they should matter to people should care about them. But the whole reason for using the slogan is that they in fact don't matter to large numbers of people around the world. They don't matter to you know, the Derek Chauvins and the George Zimmermans and the white supremacist murderers who are going around killing mostly unarmed Black men.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'll come back to one of those points in the last question after this one. So, so at a more personal level, like in your post, some notes on social distancing in Gotham Philosophical Society's website, you had shared your experience of walking your dog while the lockdown was underway, of writing on your laptop in the apartment, Jen being there in the other room. So you had said that what goes on in our heads is determined by what goes on outside of them in some surprising ways. And you had discussed the idea of ecological control by Andy Clark, where you had said the more we rely on robust, reliable sources of relevant order outside of our bodies, the less capable we are when that external order breaks down. So could you tell me about some of the ways in which you have seen this idea of ecological control play out during the pandemic?
Sure. I think this is pretty speculative, and frankly, I have a hard time thinking straight about this stuff. But I'll toss some ideas out there, and maybe other people can, you know, pick them up or reason more clearly than I can. So, the idea of ecological control is that it's a sort of strategy for problem solving that an organism can use, or that an artificial intelligence could use, I suppose. That instead of sort of, so to speak, explicitly mentally representing some order or feature of the world, the organism relies on that order outside of the creature's brain or outside of their body. So a metronome is a very good example. You can keep time in your own head. That's not hard. You can also keep time in your own feet. You can tap your feet or clap your hands, but you can also have a metronome, which helps keep time for you. So you know, we are creatures who use ecological control. We do sort of rely on, for our own sort of competent, skillful management of our relationships with the external world, these relevant sources of external order. And so then the question is, when you have something that sort of really completely disrupts everyday life in the way that our experience of lockdown has, perhaps I should note I wrote that post, I think like in the late March. I wrote it in the very beginning of the sort of worst times of the pandemic so far in New York City, where I live. So maybe take it with a grain of salt, or bear in mind that things have changed since then. So at the time, at least, the sort of relevant sources of external order that had broken down, they might have included my daily routine. So I was teaching online. I was no longer going into work. I wasn't riding the bus. I wasn't leaving the house for the same reasons. I wasn't going to the same restaurants, and so on. I think our transactions with other people might also be relevant sources of external order. Whether this is a matter of ecological control or something else is hard to say, but I think we've all had the experience of sort of having our sense of our own competence or our own identity sort of depend on some kind of external validation or reminder from other people, right? So that like my sense of, when I've gone through semesters where I haven't taught philosophy, my sense of myself as a competent philosopher, it's like very tenuous, right? Like I can be very easily sort of convinced that I'm not the real thing, that I'm an imposter, or whatever it is, if I don't get some kind of constant validation from other people. And maybe that's just me, but it is me. So among other things, the sort of competencies or skills or abilities that we have that might be, I'm not sure that they are, but that might be sort of undermined by the loss of relevant external sources of order, could be our sense of time through the changes in routine. I mean, I'm pretty sure that that's the case, because everybody's reported that their sort of subjective perception of time has just been just completely thrown off, right, in the last few months. But it could also be something deeper, something like your identity, something like your sense of your own skillfulness or competence as a philosopher, or is whatever sort of professional identity you might have. I'm lucky enough to still be employed, but of course the United States is experiencing massive unemployment right now, and certainly your sense of yourself as a useful or skilled person is for many people tied to being employed. So those are some suggestions about some ways in which the concept of ecological control might help us sort of explain or describe the vertigo or discomfort or disorientation that people have felt for the last little while. But but this is all quite speculative. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure how much mileage you can get out of the idea, although I think you can get some.
Yeah, I feel like, so I'll just get to the last question, but I had an observation. I think that the panic buying of toilet papers was one of the most explicit examples of things being so uncertain and of fixating on this one thing where you feel like, okay, I certainly need this because everything is breaking down. And people should not be going out at all, but they find a reason to go out very specifically, even though they're not, So yeah, I mean, I can understand how. So okay. So anyway. So
that's really interesting. Yeah, panic buying is among other things a response to your the loss of sort of your routines of when you need to purchase whatever the product is. We ordinarily have to buy toilet paper at such and such a rate because we're using toilet paper outside of our houses, and now we're not. And so, Yeah, that's a really interesting example.
Yeah. So okay. In the end, I want to ask you about your experience as a public philosopher. So, which could also be related to getting people to see that the opposition between all lives matter and Black Lives Matter might be more about quantity implicature or linguistic than the actual socio-political phenomena. So, as a context, you had mentioned in your 2018 blog post for APA, where you had talked about 2 years of experience of hosting Ask a Philosopher, that philosophy is for many people an interstitial activity, and we need to do real creative work to draw people into it. So, could you tell us how you conceive philosophy to be interstitial, and what kind of creative work do you feel we can do virtually to bring philosophy to people in digestive form, and also like digestible form? And how do we get people to see, given the Black Lives Matter, which is a very emotional issue, of how we as philosophers could try to sort of put it out in a way which is sensitive and yet get across the point. So, and if you feel up to it, maybe you can tell us how Ask a Philosopher book came about in that process, if you feel.
Okay, yeah, sure. I'll try to take those sort of one at a time. So, let's see, we've got the role of philosophers in BLM. We've got the Ask a Philosopher book, and we've got the sort of interstitial nature of philosophy for many people. Okay, so when professional philosophers engage in philosophy, I think our sort of paradigms for philosophical activity are things like writing papers, having lengthy discussions, reading long form pieces of writing. There are relatively few academic journals which publish pieces that are less than a few thousand words. That should give you a sense of the sort of types of philosophical engagement that philosophers think of as sort of characteristic or worthwhile. But most people aren't going to engage in philosophy in that way. They've got things to do in their lives. They're not going to spend 100 hours writing a philosophy paper or 5 hours reading one or something like that. I don't know, maybe you're a faster reader than me, but it takes me a long time to read journal articles. So if we are going to sort of find ways of inserting philosophy into people's lives, or sort of creating philosophy that can sort of work its way into people's lives one way or another, we're going to have to find ways we're going to have to find sort of the cracks in people's attention, between work and their family lives and their personal lives and everything else that they're seeing on social media or the news or whatever. So the Ask a Philosopher booth is one way of doing this. So, the basic idea is that we, set up these booths around, not these days during the pandemic, but, in the past, we've set up these booths around New York City, in parks and street fairs and things like that. And it's a handful of professional philosophers and graduate students will sit there and talk with people about their philosophical questions and ideas. Some people visit the booth intentionally, but most people just sort of stumble on it. And some people have been able to sort of, they've had some free time, they stick around for a couple of hours, but often people will stick around for a couple of minutes at a time. And so, we've sort of found a way of, in this relatively small scale, creating an opportunity for people to do philosophy sort of in their comings and goings. They're usually between, activities. But there are other ways of doing this too. I think memes are one way of doing this. So philosophy memes can so whatever else you think about philosophy memes, maybe you think they're glib, or they're lowbrow, or they're bad, or they're unserious in one way or another. But I think it's possible for people to engage with philosophy through memes, and that engagement will often be relatively brief. Where do you find a meme? You find it on social media, you find it on Reddit, and that's going to so it's just going to sort of naturally occur in between all of the other things that you pay attention to on social media or on Reddit. So memes are one way of doing this. People have suggested, I think I first heard the suggestion from my old teacher, David Shine, that you could have advertisements on, well, not advertisements exactly, but little chunks of philosophical text or philosophical prompts on buses or on subways or something like that. In New York City, in the past, there was a series, maybe it's still going on, but it was canceled at least for a few years. There was a series called Poetry in Motion, where there would be little, in the spaces where ads are normally displayed on subways and buses, there would be like a little poem, right? And, but why not do that with little chunks of philosophy? Why not do that with a little piece of, Epicurus or some thought experiment or some chunk of Aristotle or Hannah Arendt, Angela Davis, take your pick. There are all sorts of philosophers where you can find a paragraph that is provocative and useful and that people are going to engage with. So I think those are some different models for sort of making philosophy fit into the how do you pronounce it? Interstices, the interstitial. Yeah,
I googled that for this. So.
Yeah.
Interstitial.
Yeah. Not a word I say out loud every day, right? There are ways of making that work. Okay. So on the subject of the role of philosophers in the movement for Black Lives, well, of course, we can participate in the same ways that everybody else can. We can show up to rallies. We can talk about it. We can share posts, that kind of thing. But what sort of special or characteristic contributions do philosophers have to make to the movement? I mean, one answer, I don't think this is necessarily a complete answer, but one answer is to say that movements occur on multiple fronts. Movements have different create different sort of conversations or create different sorts of, or are promoted or defended in different spaces. And one sort of front on which a movement sort of unfolds is a theoretical one, where we try to offer sort of the best possible arguments that we can for the demands of the movement, where we just sort of settled or work through disputes about what those demands should be. And philosophers have a role to play in this. So, I'm thinking of work that the philosopher Femi Taiwo has done on community control of policing. So, should we be recently, since the murder of George Floyd, one of the sort of discussions has been around the abolition and defunding demands. So what does it mean to abolish the police? Is that the right demand? What sort of defunding would work? Well, if we're defunding the police, where would that funding go? And so, Femi Taiwo has sort of contributed to this discussion by offering this sort of roughly alternative approach to abolition in terms of community control. Vanessa Wills had some great work on sort of the function of the police and whether the police brutality and racist police brutality in particular is sort of dysfunction or proper function, whether this is what police exist to do in the United States or not. And you can imagine how that argument might unfold. So, those are some examples of sort of theoretical work that people can do to, that philosophers can do to, defend the central claims of the movement or sort out differences about, the proper demands of the movement. I mean, I think philosophers also, I'll say, my work on philosophy of language here isn't so much about defending the central claims of the movement as it is sort of understanding what the movement is and what and how it demands and how movements work in general, because movements are in part constituted by or closely related to their sort of characteristic speech. And so, there's a role for philosophers to play in not so much defending the movement, but in understanding the movement and its strategic strengths and weaknesses. So, there's room for philosophers. There's room for philosophers there too. Yeah. And, as for the Ask a Philosopher book, I'll make this brief just to take up the third question that you had. Yeah. I mean, it's been out for a few weeks now. I'm really happy to see it out in the world. I'm really happy to see how people have responded to it. I mean, the basic idea of the book, which came from a conversation between me and my editor at St. Martin's, was at the publisher, was sort of to collect the best questions we'd received at the booth and my attempts to answer them, and some sort of stories or vignettes about sort of memorable or affecting or thought-provoking moments from the booth. And, so it covers this. One thing that I'm happy with about how the book came out is that it covers a very wide range of questions. And there's sort of these sort of big picture, very theoretical questions about sort of the fundamental structure of the universe. And there's sort of, sometimes goofy or lighthearted, sometimes just sort of questions which wouldn't necessarily naturally occur to you. So, why is there something rather than nothing? How do we learn mathematical truths? What's the meaning of life? Those sorts of things. And then, can plants think? And is ketchup a smoothie? And, if we colonized Mars, who should own the land? Those sorts of, somewhat more left field questions. That was kind of the goal for the book, was to give people a sense of the sort of breadth of philosophy and to try to find, well, maybe not every aspect or question or problem or idea in philosophy is going to sort of resonate with you, but hopefully we can find some way of making philosophy, work for everybody.
Okay. That sounds really interesting. Congrats on that. And that sort of wraps up the questions I wanted to ask you. So thank you so much, Ian, for taking our time to do this with me. It's really helpful. And
thank you. This has just been an absolute pleasure.